So skill 306 is about combining like terms. Boy, is this an important one. Now, if you're going to put the like terms together, this y comes up first in our expression. And here's a 3y. And the problem for some people is they have a hard time because one of them has a number in front and one doesn't. So I think one of the best things you could do is to just put a 1 in front of this y and call it 1y. And this 3y here together, now it's easier to see you have 1y and 3y, and that makes a total of 4y's. All right, now I've also seen a lot of people struggle with this situation because they think 7x, take away the x, and now you only have 7. And of course, that's not right at all. So what's wrong about that? Well, really, isn't there a 1 right in front of this variable? And therefore, when you put the 7x with the negative 1x, then that will make a total of 6x. I can't just put it here, or it'll imply that they're multiplied. So that's a positive 6x because this one was bigger. So, and there's my final answer. I've combined my like terms. For skill 308, we are going to talk about rounding to the 10th place. So first, let's talk about where is the 10th place. The 10th place is this place right here. Now, if you're rounding to that place, the way I like to think of it is I would put a box around your number ending with that place. Now your choices are either you're going to keep the number the same right there, the 9, it's either going to stay the same, or if this number after it is 5 or bigger, you're going to have to round it up. Now, how on earth do you round a 9 up? Well, then I think the easiest way is to think, well, this was 29, and you're going to make it a 30, except there's a decimal in it. So it's like 2.9 has to go up to 3.0. So that is our answer to how to round that to the 10th place. I think for most people, it's easy for them if you have, like, for example, 3.74 and you round to the 10th place. It's just, well, just stop right there. But if this number is a 5 or bigger, let's say it's a 6, then they know that that number needs to go up. And if it's a 7, it's pretty easy. You make it a 3.8. That would be an example of how to round that one up. But the hardest part is when it's a 9, like the example I gave before. So if it was like 3.9 and they needed to round it up because they know this number is big enough that they have to round up, then it would be 4.0. For skill 309, we are talking about simplifying when you have parentheses like this. Well, you got to follow the order of operations, and the order of operations says that you need to do PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. So parentheses need to go first. I go inside my parentheses, and there's really nothing that I can do there. And -7 is -7, so there's nothing I can do. But then I go down to exponents for next, and that's the next thing I need to do, which is to square the -7. And of course, -7 times -7 makes positive 49. But I haven't touched this negative yet. Negative, and now I just did my parentheses, and it came out to 49. Okay, and then this -1 is still here, and it's all over 5. Now, if I take my -49, notice that negative is still there. So that's a -49, and I take away 1. Now I'm at -50 over 5. And the way I like to reduce this is I like to think of it as it's like -10 times 5 over 5 times 1. And then my 5s can cancel, aka I can reduce it, and now I've got -10 for my final answer. So it's all about doing it in the right order. So for skill 310, we are simplifying the square root of x squared. And pretty much everybody thinks that the answer to that is just x. But unfortunately, it is not. Let me explain why. If I had x squared is equal to 16, and I did the square root on both sides, the square root of x squared is the absolute value of x. And the square root of 16 is 4. See, some people confuse this and they think that the square root of 16 is two things. It's not. The square root of x squared is the absolute value of x. And the way I could prove that to you is try graphing this. Use a graphing calculator and graph the square root of x squared. I'll be your graphing calculator for you. This is what it would show. And if you've done enough graphing, you know that that is the graph of the absolute value of x. That's what this is. So your answer for that square root of x squared is the absolute value of x. So let me just finish this part of the problem then. If I was going to use that, I would say then that would lead to x equals 4 and x equals negative 4 would be the two answers to this little equation. But to answer this simple part, it's just absolute value of x. For skill 311, we are talking about simplifying when you have a variable to a power and you multiply by another variable to a power. Now, I think most people know that this is either going to be x to the 7th or x to the 10th, but you don't want to just be guessing. You have a 50-50 chance. You know that something's going to happen to those powers. So let me explain why it is what it is. X squared means x times x. It's important for you to know that. And then this times sign, I'm just bringing it straight down. Times x to the 5th is like x times x times x times x times x. See? That's what that means. So look, it's all just a big, long multiplication of x's. So that is x to the 7th, because there's 7 x's there. So that teaches us that really all you have to do is add those powers. Your answer would be x to the 7th. For skill number 2, we're going to talk about simplifying radicals. That square root of 20, that's also called a radical. Now, I think the easiest way to explain this is to show people it breaks into two square roots, because the square root of 4 times the square root of 5 would be the square root of 20. Now, I get some of you are going to be like, well, wouldn't the square root of 2 times the square root of 10 also be the square root of 20? And it would. But I'm not going to use that. I'll show you why. I want to use this one because the square root of 4 works out nicely. The square root of 4 is just 2. And the square root of 5 is the square root of 5. And there's my answer, 2 root 5. This is also equal to root 20, but it doesn't simplify down any further. So then you actually just made it more complicated. This one is simplest radical form, and that's what you need to learn how to do. So if you have a choice between two different things you could factor it into something where you have the square root of a perfect square, like 4 or 9 or 16, things that have a nice square root. And that's all I got for you on that one. For skill 312, amazing how many people think that this is 25. I know some people are going to say, I'm positive it's 25, but it's not. And the thing that you're assuming, if you think it's 25, is that this means negative 5 times negative 5, but it doesn't mean that. All right, the thing that you need to get clear is that there's a difference between this and this. Try typing this one in on your calculator and try typing this one in on your calculator exactly as you see it with the parentheses. And this one will come out to positive 25 and this one will come out to negative 25. As I know some of you won't believe me, so believe your calculator then. So why does it come out negative? Because in the end, this squared is only squaring the 5, and it has to be first because, you know, PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, the P of that is to do parentheses. The E is to do exponents, so that exponent has to be first, and that's just going to square the 5. And that'd be 25. And then the negative is still there, so it's negative 25. Final answer comes out to negative 25. If it had parentheses, it would have been positive. So if we're going to look at skill 48, that looks like this kind of problem. So if you're going to simplify a fraction, I've found what I think is the easiest way to simplify these, and that is to factor the top and to factor the bottom. And you might say, what do you mean by factoring 5? You can't factor it. Sure you can. You can factor it in 5 times 1. So even if the number is prime, like 5 is, you can always use 5 times 1. How about 35? Well, that's 5 times 7. And then look, I think most of you know that 5 over 5 is really equal to 1, so it can reduce to just a 1 over a 1. So in the end, that's 1/7. So again, my process is to factor the top and factor the bottom and let things cancel. For skill 313, here's what we're looking at. The key directions here are to substitute -2 into x squared. So it doesn't have to be -2, but especially when there's a negative number and you're putting it into a variable that's being squared. This happens a lot in high school math. You should use parentheses for this. All right, so we're going to use parentheses because our x squared is going to turn into empty parentheses squared. And then you drop in the -2. Now you might think, well, I do that. I just don't use the parentheses. So like when I do it, I do x squared, and then I drop in the -2, and then I square it like that. But if you've looked at some of our other videos, you may remember that this one comes out to positive 4, whereas this one, without the parentheses, it comes out to -4. So you can't just do it this way. It won't work because -4 is not correct. So you should always use a parenthesis where the variable was, and then drop the number inside those parentheses like this, because it makes a difference in your final answer. For skill 314, we're talking about the x and the y-axis and whether they're vertical or horizontal and what the equation is for those. I think most people by now know that that's the x-axis and that's the y-axis. But if I ask you for the equation for the x-axis, what's the equation for this line right here? It's counterintuitive. You would think it'd be x equals 0, but it is not. The line that runs right here is y equals 0. Okay? Conversely, for the y-axis, that would be the line x equals 0 that runs right through it. All right, so to answer this question, what's the equation for the x-axis? It would be y equals 0. And is it vertical or horizontal? If you've gotten those confused in the past, the horizon goes across like that black line. So that is a horizontal line. So to answer my question, what's the equation for the x-axis? It's y equals 0, and that is horizontal. If it was the y-axis you wanted, it would be the opposite of those. The y-axis would be x equals 0, and it would be vertical. Okay, for skill 315, n to the power of 2. The way we would say that is n squared. Does that mean 2n or n times n? I do see this struggle for some kids. They see a 2 there, they see an n, and they're thinking, isn't that the same as 2n? Nope. This n squared means n times n. And that's really important for you to understand. So if, for example, it had been x to the third, that means x times x times x. okay? It does not mean 3x. That'd be a completely different thing. All right, so that's an important one. Next, let's talk about skill 76. You're solving for n, and you've got this equation. I like to think of this as you're trying to get the n alone, because if n was alone at the end and n was equal to something, we would have solved it. So if I want to get the n alone, I ask myself, what's next to the n? That's the only thing I need to get rid of, and then the n will be alone on its side of the equal sign. So if I need to get rid of that -4, you just want to do the opposite operation. So if there's a -4 there, I'm going to use +4. And I'm going to do that on both sides of the equation. You can add or subtract anything you want on both sides of an equation, as long as you do it to both sides. And so then these will cancel out, and technically it's n plus 0, but most people just say that's n. And 10 plus 4 is 14. Did I get the n alone? Yep. I used the opposite of whatever was next to it. And I got to make sure to do it to both sides. How about skill 79? The reason this one's here is because there's variables on both sides of this equation. If I have variables on both sides, then I need to solve this for x. That means get the x all alone at the end. And I can't do that unless I get the variables all onto one side. Now there are two choices in what you do here, but most of you have been trained that you're supposed to get rid of the smaller of the two x's, the variables. Get rid of the smaller one. Get rid of meaning you take it away. So if I take away 5x from this side and take away 5x from that side, this usually freaks people out because there's nothing left. 5x minus 5x is nothing, but it's actually 0. And 7x minus 5x is 2x. And then subtract 2. And now from here, I just have to add 2 to both sides. 2 equals 2x. And we're going to divide by 2 on both sides. And x equals 1. Now, it would have been okay to solve this one a different way. You wouldn't have had to start with subtracting 5x on both sides. You could have subtracted 7x from both sides, and you'll get the same answer. Let me show you. It is not a law that you have to get rid of the smaller one. It just usually saves you some time. But in this case, if I subtract 7x from both sides, then this one will go away, and this one will be negative 2x. And then I'm dividing by negative 2, and I get x equals 1, and that's even faster. So either way, you have to, if you have variables on both sides, you got to get rid of one of the two. Okay, for skill 28. For skill 28, we are taking this problem and focusing on this power of 3. If that power of 3 wasn't there, there wouldn't be anything to do at all. Because inside the parentheses, you can't combine the 2 and the x squared any more than they already are. That's 2x squared. So then it's just about putting it to the third. There's two things people forget. Number one, they forget that the 2 has to be put to the third. 2 to the third means 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. And then you have the x squared that has to be put to the third. Now, I totally get that some people are like, well, I'm not sure if I multiply the 2 and the 3 or if I add the 2 and the 3. But I want you to think about what it really means. X squared really means x times x. And then you're putting it to the third. And I'm just bringing the 8 down here. To the third really means that we take that x times x and we multiply it by another x times x, and we multiply by another x times x. We do it 3 times. There, there, and there. So I bet you're seeing now that this one's going to come out to 8x to the 6th. Turns out you do multiply the powers when they're like that. So for skill 222, we're talking about solving for y. Now, solving for y, there's like a million reasons that you want to solve for y, but one of the best ones is that when you're done, when you got solved for y, it's easy to graph, and it's easy to tell the y-intercept and the slope from that. So that's the reason you want to solve for y. You want to get y alone. So if you're going to get y alone, and again, there's multiple other reasons you might want to do that, but if you want to get y alone, first of all, figure out where y is. It's right there. And to get it alone on its side of the equation, well, I'm on the left side of the equation here with the y, I'm going to start by getting rid of the 2x. I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. And 2x minus 2x is 0. I could put 0, but I could also just skip it and say it's 4y equals 8 minus 2x. Always put the variable first. This is standard form to put the variable first. Now I'm going to divide everything by 4. And my y is alone. I have solved for y. I'm going to simplify this to negative 1/2 x. That's important that you understand that negative 2x over 4 would simplify to negative 1/2 x. Plus 8 divided by 4 is 2. And now I've got my y-intercept, and I've got my slope. That's one of many reasons that you'd want to solve for y. That's how you do it. Okay, for skill 8, that is where we're talking about distributing. Now, one of the challenges for kids is when they have a times 2a, or with any variable, they're not sure exactly what to do with that. Like, is it, they have 2a's and a 2, so is it like 4a? Well, really what this means is a times 2 times a, because 2a really means 2 times a, right? And then if you just rearrange that and put the 2 in the front, because you can do that, there's a property of math that's called the commutative property. It says you can do that. Then it's really just 2 times a, which is really 2a squared. Okay, so this is 2a squared. Now you take the a times the negative 3, and you get negative 3 times a, or negative 3a. And that is how to distribute that kind of problem. For skill 307, that's a problem like this. We're solving for x, and there's x, and there's variables on both sides again. So how do we take care of ones where there's variables on both sides? Well, again, you're typically getting rid of the smaller one. So if I do that here, the smaller one is negative x. I add x to both sides, and now I have 5 plus 2x equals 0. Now I can subtract 5 from both sides, and I'd have 2x equals negative 5. I could divide by 2 on both sides, and x equals negative 5/2. So, moral of the story, when you have variables on both sides, you just get rid of the smaller of the two. Now, just so you know, you could have also subtracted x from both sides, and it would have actually worked out to 5 equals negative 2x, and that would have been faster. We would divide both sides by negative 2 then. And look at that. The blue work is only 2 steps. So either way works. Either way gets you what you need, which is x is alone, and it's equal to negative 5 over 2. This negative could go to the top if you wanted. Next, we're going to look at skill 316. For skill 316, we are factoring the number 10. And notice it says small to large. Well, the way I like to make my factors is I like to think of it as 10 is equal to 1 times 10, or in this case, 5 times 2. And so all of those are factors. These are my factors of 10. Factoring is one of the most critical basic skills you got to have in math. So then the only challenge now is to list them from small to large. So I'll put 1, and then 2, and then 5, and then 10. And now they're listed from small to large. That's what I mean by listing the factors of 10. So for skill 317 down here, we're taking a look at a simplified problem where PEMDAS is apparently important. That's just a order of operations where you're supposed to do the parentheses first. See, a lot of times kids get this problem and they have it in their heads somehow that you just go from left to right and they start with this. You can't start with that. That is a subtract problem. And add and subtract problems like that, they have to happen last, see? What has to happen first is the parentheses. So you've got to go here first. 3 minus 1 is 2, okay? And then I'm going to rewrite the problem. It's really common for people to not realize that they're doing it in the wrong order because they try to do 2 steps at once. There, I've just done the parentheses. Now, is there any exponents that I can do? Nope, no exponents in this problem, so I can skip that one. Next is any multiply or divide problems, and those are tied. A lot of people don't know that, but multiply and divide are tied. So you do them, if you find a multiply and a divide, you go from left to right. But here, there's only a multiply, and it's right there. So I'm going to multiply this times this. My new answer copied down here is -2 minus 8. Okay? And then the last thing I have is adds and subtracts. At the end here, you could think of this as -2 plus -8 or -2 minus 8. Either way, you put them together and they make -10. And I did my add subtract last. So it's all about the order that you do these in. So for skill of 318, we are trying to convert a decimal to a percent. Now, a lot of people think, oh, I know what percents look like. Percents are like 4% or maybe 4.2%. And I can just look at this and go, that's got to be 4.2%. Nope. When you're changing a decimal to a percent, you have to move the decimal over exactly 2 spots, like that. So in this case, it's 0.42%. So again, if you had 0.048 and I wanted the percent for that, I'd move the decimal over exactly 2 spots. That one would be 4.8%. This one would be 0.42%. Do you get that that's less than 1%? So moral of the story here is you just have to move your decimal over exactly the right number of places to get it to be a percent. Move it over 2 places.